All right, we've covered the first two subphases of separation individuation. The third phase is called reapproachement. That's a French word for reapproachment. The translation's a little bit shaky. It just means a coming back. And this is the complicated part about this phase, and it's from 16 to 24 months, is that the child has become complex enough. The brain, the mind have become experienced enough that it can, for the first time, start recognizing a little bit better the reality of who and what it is. And so the omnipotence of the younger child's running and controlling things, or seeming to, or wanting to, falls away a little bit in favor of a more realistic assessment. And this causes some parents some problems because they don't understand what's going on in their mind. The child who 1 week was running around loose on the playground now becomes clingy, now gloms onto dad's leg or mom's leg and won't go out anymore. And it looks like a problem. It looks like a regression. It looks like something's wrong. They were just doing it last week. Why aren't they doing it now? And what has happened is it quite literally is a developmental achievement to realize that the world's a dangerous place, that they now see themselves more realistically, more maturely, and they aren't running around loose with delusions of grandiosity and omnipotence. So that they get out there a little ways and they go, oh my goodness, I'm just a little kid. I'm just out here by myself. My mommy's a long way away. I've got to go back. It's scary. And they glom on a little bit, and they are not so likely to go running around loose and get lost. They're much more clingy. And I think parents that don't understand that as a developmental achievement see it as a developmental regression and then punish the child or reject them or push them beyond their emotional capability. And if that happens, the child, quite frankly, feels traumatized. So we have to recognize, and this may be the most important point, both these things are happening in the child simultaneously. There's a conflict. I want to be independent. I want to be connected to mom. They seem, to a child, inconsistent. Sometimes they seem to a mother or father inconsistent. They aren't. They're a perfectly appropriate developmental place. And I think if you look at our adult lives, no one should be surprised. We want to be together, and sometimes we want our own space. This is a perfect recreation of a developmental phase of childhood, which parents now don't seem to understand very well. It is both a deliberate search for and avoidance of the mother, shadowing her and warding her off. And this can be very confusing and very frustrating for a mother who doesn't understand what's going on developmentally. This is also when children learn their first word. And I ask this question rhetorically in class all the time. What's the first word a child learns? Most of the time, the answer is no. Or, the second favorite, mine. They learn no and mine. Now, we are rubbing up against 24 months. That's called what? Most people in our culture have heard the phrase, the terrible twos. And I hate that phrase. I admit it. I hate it. It frustrates me because there's no such thing as a terrible 2-year-old. There are only terrible parents who don't understand the developmental needs of their 24-month-old child. There's nothing terrible about what the child is doing or being. They are simply in a normal phase of their own internal conflict that they're acting out, and they're in conflict. Okay, who isn't? You don't get to call people terrible because they have conflicts. Who's consistent? Who's without contradiction in their lives? Certainly no one I've met lately. One of my favorite poets, Walt Whitman, once said, someone accused him in his poetry of not being consistent, and he says, or contradicting himself, and he said, contradict myself? Well, very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. And I think that's a beautiful poetic expression for exactly what's going on in a very young child's mind. There's lots going on in their little minds, and it's not consistent. And we have to recognize that that lack of consistency is really a perfectly normal developmental phase, and that no is part of it. No is their attempt to figure out the boundaries between you and me, between mom and the child, between dad and the child. Mine isn't about greed, it's about need. The need to recognize not just my body's difference from my mother, but apparently all these things I now can get my hands on. Some of them are mine, some of them are somebody else's. It's figuring out that relational dynamic. It is a relational dynamic both within the child's complex and getting more and more complex mind and between the child and the various people and objects in its life. So, no, it's a perfectly reasonable word. Mine, perfectly reasonable word. We cannot impugn moral consequences to a 2-year-old's intentions. I don't think a 2-year-old can be greedy. They don't understand the concept. That's a moral concept beyond the capability of their 2-year-old little brains. One of my most horrible, tragic cases in my clinical practice was a young woman. She was 18. She had a 18-month-old son. And she was in a housing program, transitional housing program for homeless women and their very young children. And I was working with her and her child. And she had a boyfriend who would come over occasionally to the housing program. And she reported to me one day in session that the boyfriend had taken his belt off and beat the child with it because the child had, in his word, disrespected him. And I informed the young mother that if she allowed that to continue, she would lose custody of her child, that that's abusive, that's hideously abusive, and she cannot tolerate it no matter what. And that developmentally, there isn't any chance the child disrespected her so-called boyfriend because the child had no concept of respect, barely had a concept of the existence of others outside, might have said no, might have said mine. I don't know what the child said. It wasn't clear. But it doesn't matter. What happened was that individual, clearly a severely disturbed individual in his own right, with his own developmental history, responded projectively, responded from his own neurosis, and impugned meaning in the child that absolutely was not there. And the result was very painful for the child and so unnecessary. So, I've had students and some patients ask me about tantrums. Some children about this stage seem to fall apart sometimes when they're frustrated, usually when they don't get something they want, and can fall down on the floor and kick and scream. And most parents, when this happens in the cereal aisle of Albertsons, are horribly embarrassed and shamed and usually grab up the kid and get them out of there as soon as possible. Now, I have a sense that when that happens sometimes, especially with slightly older kids, that child has learned. That child is manipulating. They know that they can get mom to do stuff if they behave in a certain way. That's cognitive behaviorist conditioning. That's not what I'm talking about here. Earlier, 16 to 24 months, when the child seems to fall apart, quite frequently it's because they're falling apart emotionally. That they're torn by this sense of themselves that isn't quite integrated, is contradictory. And when they don't get what they want, they frequently cannot contain the anxiety. They cannot contain the anger, the fear, the frustration. And their little minds do seem, in fact, to fall apart. They're not wholly together firmly yet. And so this is one of those examples where you must look at not the thing, but the meaning of the thing. The child is behaving in a certain way. If the child is being consciously manipulative because they've learned that they can get what they want if they do this, then the parent's response needs to be change their parenting style, get some other things done, and do not tolerate that kind of behavior anymore. If the child literally is falling apart because they are experiencing the frustration as the abandonment of the mother of symbiosis, as the anxiety caused by the recognition of separateness and their attendant vulnerability, which they can't handle, then the mother's response has to be very different. It has to be a containing response. It has to be an enveloping, containing response that provides a soothing presence for the child to take in. Perfect example. Not the thing, it's the meaning of the thing. If the mother doesn't recognize the unconscious, psychological, emotional meaning of the behavior, she can't respond in a way that fosters growth and development. During this phase, the 16 to 24 months, this is where what Winnicott also called transitional objects, a transitional object, a teddy bear, a binky, a blankie. This is when those items become incredibly important to the child. If you've ever had an 18-month-old who has it's his or her favorite little binky or blankie or teddy bear, and you go take them into the car for a ride, and the child realizes he or she doesn't have it and starts wailing and screaming, you might as well go back to the house and get it, because it's going to be a miserable ride if you don't. Now, what's the meaning of the transitional object? It isn't just that the child really, really, really likes the teddy bear. Okay, that's not what's going on. And if you think that way and don't go get it, you are doing something that's quite seriously traumatizing the child, I think. The mother of symbiosis, the oneness experience with the mother, slowly gives way to separation individuation. And yet, it's not a smooth process. There are contradictions and conflicts. And the child needs something to transition from oneness with the mother to autonomy. Now, that's what the transitional object is. The teddy bear, the binky, the blankie, whatever. In the child's fantasy, it's the soothing mother. It's a representation of the soothing mother's presence when the mother isn't there. And so to take it away too soon is to almost literally tear the child's mind apart. The goal is not to have a binky, a blankie, or a teddy bear when the child is 9. If that's the case, something's seriously wrong with their development. There's no question about that. But they shouldn't need a transitional object very much or very long if in the normal course of their development they can progress and achieve a certain sense of self, a certain consistent self-state over time and emotion, a certain sense of identity, a certain strong, Freud called it, ego function, okay? So transitional objects are just that, transitioning from the symbiotic oneness of mother to autonomy, and in fantasy they simply represent the absent mother, and they're good for the child. I think fathers probably do more of this incorrectly than mothers. Mothers sort of instinctively know the child needs it. A father doesn't want to see his son, especially, if this child is 3 or 4, they don't want to see that. And my son doesn't need one of those. And the child freaks out and falls apart, and the father thinks he's weak. That's a disaster for the child, and it's probably not very good for the father either. Fathers need to understand, as mothers need to understand, the psychological meaning of these things. What hopefully happens between 16 and 24 months is that the extremes, the splitting into all good and all bad that was the highlight of the younger infant's emotional dynamic, becomes modulated. We see emotional displays that have some ambivalence to them. We see the child get a little bit frustrated but not go over the top. We see them be a little bit happy but not that ecstatic bliss feeling. All right? This is a sign of maturity. If they can tolerate frustration a little longer without falling apart, then they've internalized a sense of the parent's strength and self and capability and security and trust. And if they get frustrated, they have some trust that their needs will be met soon. And so they don't have to act out. It isn't the end of the world. It isn't extreme. They don't feel like they're tossed into the abyss. All right, all is not lost. They just need to wait a little while. Where before they couldn't do that, now they can. They've taken in a stronger sense of themselves from an appropriately attentive, devoted mother. What also is noticed, and this is absolutely essential, is that symbolic activities and play come to predominate. And that means children aren't just having a rattle and shaking it because it sounds good. They're now constructing fantasies. They're now constructing games. They're now playing in roles or starting to. This is essential because I think one of the things that developmental psychology is now clear on is that play for a child is a hell of a lot of hard work. It is the child's work in some ways. They are trying on new roles. They're playing whatever they're playing with. And at some stage you see young children play with toys, play with cars, play with dolls, play with trucks, play with horses, play with whatever they're playing with. And you see very quickly that the child's got a fantasy of what's going on. They're the fireman, they're the nurse, they're the doctor, they're the horse, they're the monster, they're whatever they are. This is a developmental achievement. It has to be fostered. One of the most traumatized patients, again, I've ever dealt with was a young man who remembered in his earliest childhood, he had one toy. He had a cassette box. Most people don't know what a cassette is anymore. It's a music on tape in a small plastic rectangle. The plastic, thin plastic box it came in, empty of any labels, that was his toy. It was the only toy his parents gave him. It was all he could play with because they were from a fairly fundamental religious group and they thought that that was appropriate. Playing is foolishness. Playing takes you away from devotion to God was their way of thinking about it. The problem is that the child's mind couldn't develop, couldn't grow. I never forget that case, that his only toy in his earliest childhood was a cassette case. That's not enough. Children don't need warehouses full of toys. Toys R Us is a statement of American parents' overreaction to things. Children, I think a plastic cassette box, not enough. Emptying out the Toys R Us warehouse into the kid's bedroom, too much. We forget the meaning of these things. You cannot substitute loving emotional connection to the parents with things, toys. Getting the kid lots of toys does not mean you love them. Loving them means you love them. And if you don't know how, substituting toys won't work. It is also at this stage that gender differences start becoming apparent. Another line of research done mostly now by cognitive behaviorist researchers, completely separate from the psychoanalytic perspectives I've been talking about, but they come to similar conclusions, that boys and girls aren't equal, that they do not do things the same, they do not react the same, they do not desire the same things. This is a terrible shock to some of the extreme types in the feminist movement. I'm sorry if that offends anybody, but there are gender differences in boys and girls in their preferences that are not a function of cultural imprinting or cultural learning or cultural prejudices. We are evolved creatures, theoretically, in environments that have privileged certain reactions and certain biological predispositions in men and women. And if you have a complaint about that, complain to God or Darwin, because the reality is little boys and little girls are different. And those differences, if they are not understood, respected, and taken in, it means that you cannot meet the needs of the children. If you treat them as identical, equal, in some sort of grotesque exercise in moral equivalence, then you will do damage to the children because they aren't the same and they cannot be made to be the same without significant psychic damage. That isn't a license for sexism. It isn't a license for abuse or neglect. It is a simple request to acknowledge reality and what science has now shown us beyond argumentation. The Earth goes around the sun. 400, 500 years ago, that was disputed. It's no longer disputed. Boys and girls are different. 20, 30 years ago, that was disputed. It is no longer disputed. It is fact. It is science. And we have to be honest and deal with the ramifications of it. At the end of the third subphase, perhaps maybe more important than the other phases, the response of the parents becomes possibly more extreme. A father with a 2-year-old probably doesn't enact things too destructively, one hopes. But as the children reach that 2-year mark plus, what we find is the parents' expectations start becoming quite activated. And this is where that idea of the dance comes in and it has to stay in. That boys and girls will have to be moved in a slightly different rhythm. One dance isn't better than the other, but it's a different dance. And both parents need to move in and out with the child's developmental needs. You can't keep them locked to you. You can't abandon them. I will add one thing about the father. From the beginning, I think the role of the father is often disputed. The role of the father early on, prior to the child's birth, prenatally. Let's go with prenatally now, apparently. The role of the father is to contain the mother who prenatally, physically, literally contains the baby. Postnatally, after birth, primary maternal preoccupation, the father's role, again primarily, is to contain the containing mother. But very soon, I'm going to say from birth on, the father has an independent relationship with the child. The father holds the child. Most fathers, including this one, was present at the birth of my 2 daughters. I held them almost immediately. I developed an independent relationship with them from the beginning. That seems appropriate. It seems healthy. The father's role is not just container for the mother. It's also a container directly for the children. And I think it serves one additional purpose that's absolutely essential. In symbiotic oneness with the mother, the child is tied into a blissful place. Why leave? What would motivate a child in symbiotic oneness with the mother to leave? Everything's fine. Oh, except for that guy. He's interesting. He's got a certain energy level to him. He's got this beard thing going on. I can pull at that. That's kind of scratchy feeling. I wonder what else he's got going on. A father is part of the seductive bringing out of the baby's mind into the world. A part of that, look at that. That's interesting. There's an energy level there. And so the father's role all along, containing the mother, containing the baby, connected to the baby completely separately from the mother or in addition to the mother. And this third role, and I think it starts from birth, maybe before, but it becomes heightened in this end of the 24-month, the last of the separation individuation subphases. We see the father then pulling the child out of the symbiotic oneness, the final stages of that. And this is where my supervisor's phrase comes in. The mother creates the self in the child. The father introduces that self to the world. It is this phase that the father's more active, direct involvement with the child seems to kick in at a developmentally appropriate way. All right, final phase of the Mahler scheme is object constancy. That's technically 24 to 36 months, up to the 3-year mark. But Mahler herself gets that this is an open-ended and really this is the beginning of our understanding of lifetime development. If there's been good enough parenting up to that point, if the environment has been adequate and good enough, if the genetics to begin with have been good enough, then what we find is the child at age 3 now has a stable sense of its own identity, a stable sense of self, a stable sense of itself in a relationship to parents. And this is true across emotional variants, across emotional states. A stable and reliable, predictable, trustworthy relationship with the mother and the father. The phrase here is object permanence. The child knows who it is, knows who its mother is, knows who its father is. And in that context, we have an immense leap in cognitive ability, the ability to start now thinking. The take-home lesson here, folks, is that emotions come first. Can a 2-month-old baby think? No, they have no language. Do they have emotions? Quite obviously, and lots of them, and they're very intense. So what this means, when you get to this phase, when you get to the end of this 3-year-long developmental process, 2 to 3 years, it varies, but at least by 3 years, we have the ability to think in language. And if we don't, something's wrong, not with the language, but with the emotional underpinning, the emotional bedrock, the object constancy, the sense of self, the emotional security and trust of that parental relationship has not been adequately internalized. All learning disorders are disorders of emotion, are anxiety disorders. I walked out in front of a class one time of child development and I said, there's no such thing as a learning disorder. And everyone was real nervous for a minute, and stealing a little note from Winnicott there, I said, there's only disorders of emotional containment. If the child can't think, it's because they're too drenched in anxiety, because they haven't had an emotionally stabilizing childhood. Get the emotions right, the thinking flows naturally out of that. That is the end of Margaret Mahler's developmental paradigm. I'm going to go back now and look at some sort of larger questions to try to make some larger sense out of it. This is a theory. It's not received wisdom. It's not a mathematical truth. But I want to argue that it's useful, and that's my standard. If the science supports it, if the clinical judgment supports it, if the clinical evidence that we get support it, then I'm not going to say it's some absolute truth. I'm going to say it's useful, and that's my standard. Does a psychological theory, like Mahler's theory of child development, does it correspond to the data? Is it internally consistent? If those things are true, then like a good scientific method, we can create a way of thinking about the mind that is useful. It helps us raise our children better. One of the things I'm trying to do is not use theory in some fragmented way. Everybody's got their pet theory. I think the way that this makes sense is to try to tie them together and integrate. If the child's mind is integrating various emotions and biology and physical experiences and genetics together, I think in an odd way, something similar is happening in our theoretical discussions. We need more integration if we can pull together different strands of theory that are useful. Then I think we can have a better picture of the child's mind and be in a better position to understand their fundamental needs and therefore be better parents. One way of thinking about this progression of the child's mind is the idea of cohesion, reality-related, and object-related. What I mean by that, cohesion. A mind of a baby is thought of as sort of fragmented, random. It's a buzzing confusion to the child. That makes sense to me. If you look at enough babies, you see that they're kind of all over the place. And slowly, very slowly, if enough love is present, they cohere. Their mind becomes more cohesive. Once that happens, or to the extent, or as that's happening thoroughly, we then see them dealing with reality a little better than they could before. They get inside and outside. The third phase is they become object-related, meaning they're in relationships. They start recognizing not just external things, but there are individuals, there are people, there are relationships that are important to me, which is a significant psychological maturing. So cohesion, reality-related, object-related. If you can see that progression happening, you're on the right track. It seems to me that the most important conclusion of all of this is that in order for that progression to happen, more and more science, more and more evidence is suggesting that it requires the presence of a mother. a maternal matrix, an individual single one mother providing the matrix within which all of this developmental dynamic can happen. The mother is more than a presence providing food, clothing, and shelter. The mother, this is the take-home lesson from this, the mother is the mediator of organization, of self-structure. The mother doesn't just provide a place for the child to grow. It is almost literally the mind of the mother being given to the child. It is the mind and the emotional context of the mother that the child takes in. And there's lots of technical words for that. Introjection, identification, and others. But you almost feel it's true when you watch a baby and a mother together. They're taking in the mother's mind the way they take in milk. It's almost literally the same process. I think when Freud started, as good as he did and as revolutionary as ideas were, he was totally focused on the father, because that's what his culture was. I think what's happened in the last 50 years is that we've lost the father, and everything was about the mother. The pendulum may be now swinging, hopefully back to somewhere near the middle, where we can see, in terms of the needs of the baby, the absolute necessity of the mother. But there's no such thing as a mother by herself. And it has to have someone or some group of ones around her to ensure that she can provide the containment, can provide the presence that the baby's mind needs to be able to take in. The idea here is a baby doesn't just grow up. No child just grows up. They have to be raised. And it is the mind of the mother, first and foremost, that provides the structure within that the baby's mind is developed. And I'm going to be a little bit theoretical now, because I have to be. There's no other way of thinking about what's going on in the baby's mind better than Melanie Klein and her followers in the object relational school of psychology. Object relations, this idea that what the baby is taking in actually, what is the baby taking in? What is the experience in the baby's mind? And I know this sounds a little strange, and I don't have a better way to put it, and I don't think anybody else does either, and it's really, really useful, so I'm going to go with it until I find something better. That what the baby takes in are fantasies, representations, a mental image of their experience with the mother. And it's literally taken in as an experience, and it's in the baby's mind. And this is what we call an object. Mental images of the primary caretaker. These internalized object relationships, because you take in lots of relationships, lots of experiences, they're all in there. And how they get organized in a mind is the mind. That becomes who you are. That is the sense of self. It is the template for all mental and emotional functions. That internalization of loving relationships and all of the not so loving experiences that the child has as well, all of that in there, and primarily self and other object relationships in this fantasy. Now, let me explain fantasy. Fantasy, when you say it in the normal course of a discussion, fantasy seems to be, I think about winning the lottery. What am I going to do when I win the lottery? That's my fantasy. Not what we're talking about here. The child isn't thinking that way. That's a conscious thought in language and images. This is unconscious. Fantasies in the psychological sense are entirely unconscious. And the child's mind seems to be built up in layers of these unconscious fantasies. When a child has an emotion, you can see it in their face. But what's going on in their mind? If the child is screaming with a case of diaper rash, the fantasy is undoubtedly that of being burned alive, of fire. All right? When the child is afraid of something happening, the fantasy is undoubtedly something devouring the child. When the child is lonely and afraid and anxious, the fantasy has something to do with being tossed into the abyss, abandoned, out there alone. Terrible terror, the worst imaginable for a child, is the fear of abandonment. If there are enough good objects in the child's mind. If there are enough good objects, we then have the ability to deal more realistically with the outside world. And this is where the great split comes between object relations, unconscious, psychic reality, and external reality. A healthy child raised with a good enough mother and father will have the ability to recognize themselves and external reality, will recognize the difference between feelings and facts. If the child is angry, it isn't because the mother or the father are evil. It's because something's happened in their relationship and they're disagreeing about something or they're frustrated, and the child will realize it's bringing something to the table a little bit, and they can talk about it, at least when the child's a slight bit older. But people who grow up without a good enough childhood end up with what we call borderline dynamics, or other defense mechanisms too extreme, or a lack of adequate psychic structure. A lot of ways to characterize it. But what you see is rigid ways of thinking, rigid ways of feeling, narrowing of the psychological responses that a broader, playful, creative, healthy person has. It's possible that the most important characteristic or symptom of mental illness is the lack of this creative spontaneity, this lack of the ability to recognize feelings from facts, to recognize an interior experience of their own psychic reality as different from external reality. Paranoia is understood as the projection of bad objects into the outside world, and then treating the world as if those bad objects are real. We all know a paranoid isn't afraid of reality. This type of thinking gives us a theory that explains a great deal of both child development and adult dysfunctional experience. One of the things that seems clear from the research is that the patterns laid down in childhood from birth to 3 or 4 become the pattern of that child's mind throughout life. There was an old saying several hundred years ago by the Jesuits, the Catholic Church's scholars and teachers. They said, give me a child from birth to 7, and it doesn't matter what you do after that. And I think to some extent they were correct. That the things that get laid down in a child's mind from birth to 4 or 5 lay down the bedrock of their personality, the fundamental structure of their mind and their identity. And after that, it becomes polishing the apple, correcting the mistakes, but you're not going to change your character, your personality, your identity very much after that at all. You can get better, you can get stronger. That's what good therapy does. But who you are is not going to change at a fundamental level. So the advice here, folks, is spend the time, spend the effort, be good enough parents. Get it right from birth to 3 or 4, and you will save yourselves a lifetime of suffering and struggle for your children. So let me wrap up. I think that may be the best way to wrap it up. The idea that if you understand the developmental needs of the child, you must change the way you raise children. Unless everything I've just said is old news, unless you've already done the reading and the research, much of what I've said now will be sort of disconcerting and a little bit potentially even shocking. But if you can take it in, it will inevitably have a very powerful effect on the quality of your parenting and the immediate life of your children, and hopefully the long-term life of your children. I will continue this series of lectures with some nuts and bolts and specifics of how good parenting, good enough parenting, can manage that difficult process. I look forward to that. I hope you do. Thank you.